The ways that people kill and are being killed around us are absolutely horrific. This week, we're going to look at a case that is certainly in that category. This week, we look at a brutal murder of a beautiful young woman who had her entire life ahead of her. She and her vehicle were set on fire, and sadly, this case still has not come to any type of resolution. One can even wonder if the right suspect has even been found. Hello, my name is Lance, and welcome to episode 142 of Gone But Never Forgotten, The Murder of Jessica Chambers. Jessica Chambers was from a small town in Mississippi called Cortland. The population of the city is around 500 people, and it's just on the outskirts of Batesville, another very small town. It's located about an hour south of Memphis, Tennessee. In Cortland, almost everybody knows everybody. All of the children have grown up together and gone to school together, and the town is very slow-paced, and most people are blue-collar workers who work in the industrial industry or within farming. The population is split between black people and white people, with there being more black people than white people overall. A lot of the people in Cortland also live below the national poverty level, which is totally not uncommon for most small towns like Cortland in that area of the United States. Cortland falls in the area that is referred to as the Bible Belt, and Cortland loves two things: faith and football. Jessica attended South Panola High School, which is located in Batesville. The school has an average registration of just over 1,100 students, and it's known for training up fantastic football players, many of whom move on to attend esteemed colleges and esteemed universities, and they also receive scholarships. Jessica, at a younger age, had been very good at playing softball, but when she started high school, she pivoted, and she tried out for and made the cheerleading squad. In the squad, Jessica was a flyer, meaning that because of her small size, she was one of the girls that was thrown into the air by the team. Jessica was small. She was blonde, and she was a beautiful former cheerleader, which at the end of the day would wind up likely being the main reason that her story would take off and go viral. That, and the fact that this story is like no other that I have ever heard before. In Cortland, Jessica lived with her parents, Ben and Lisa, and her siblings. Jessica's mom would openly state that Jessica was not always perfect. Her parents openly admitted that Jessica had made mistakes in her life and that she had delved into people and things that she shouldn't have, such as drugs. But they also said that not too terribly long before the horrific story that we're about to go through, Jessica had had her own coming to Jesus moment, so to speak. Jessica had realized that she needed to make some changes in her life, and she needed to get herself back on the right track. In the late summer of 2014, Jessica would spend just over 1 month at Leah's house. Leah's house is a Christian rehabilitation center for women, where their focus is helping women that are over the age of 18 to recover from addictions, behavioral problems, depression, self-harm, or women who have been incarcerated. Jessica had certainly struggled with levels of addictions, and she had been in trouble with the police previously. The stay at Leah's house was to help Jessica get some perspective and to remove her from the situations and the people that she had been dealing with on a regular basis. When Jessica returned, it was visible to everyone that she had indeed made some changes. A week after she returned home, she found a job, but she also would tell her family shortly after returning that she was afraid for her life. One day in particular, she came home and she slammed the door shut and said that people were accusing her of snitching on them. It seemed like she had cleaned up and she was putting some distance between herself and her old life, but people were seeing those changes, and the fact that her father worked as a mechanic for the sheriff's office, combined with the changes that Jessica was making, people started to think that she could not be trusted any longer. Jessica was being accused of wearing a wire, and Jessica was being accused of outing people, but nobody except for her accusers believed for a moment that those things were true. As an aside, when I was younger, I personally made the decision to move to an entirely new province. Part of that reason was because of a lady, I'll be honest. I had known her for a long time, but another part of that was that I recognized that I needed to get away from people, and I needed to get away from situations in my life and get a fresh start. It's certainly not an easy thing to do. When you're told that once you get into some situations, it's hard or impossible to get out, it's not a lie. It is incredibly difficult. I would imagine that it would be even more difficult when you were still living in the same small town as the people and the situations that you were trying to extricate yourself from. From what I understand, as much as you can from a distance, it was believed that Jessica was a very trusting person, and she did not care about someone's past, only how they treated her. And as such, she was friends with people who had criminal records, she was friends with people who dealt and did drugs, and other various things of those natures. When you live in a town of only 500 people and you try to turn your life around, I can see from personal experience how that would be suspect to certain types of people. And then came December 6th of 2014. On that date, two men came across a vehicle that was engulfed in flames on the side of the road in Cortland and called for emergency services. A volunteer firefighter would be the first person on the scene, and he said that as he pulled up, he could feel the heat from the fire, which had fully engulfed the car. He said then, as he approached the vehicle, a woman came walking out of the forest, and the sight was indeed a grisly scene. Jessica, much like the car, was on and had been on fire, and she was completely burned. The volunteer firefighter said that her entire body seemed to be burnt, and it was so black that her body looked like someone had rubbed charcoal all over her body. He said that even though Jessica would have clearly been in unimaginable pain, she was not complaining about the pain or anything, likely because she was probably in shock. Jessica was only wearing a pair of panties and was completely naked aside from that. The firefighter grabbed a blanket, and as best he could, he wrapped her up in it for warmth and to cover her up. Jessica and her car had been located around 8:10 p.m. Many of the first responders would later testify to the fact that when they arrived on the scene, they asked Jessica, who had set her and her car on fire, and they said that she clearly said Eric had done it. She didn't say a discernible last name or anything. All that she had said and all that people had heard was either Eric or Derek had done this. It was deemed that a flammable liquid had been poured onto the car and onto Jessica's body and even up her nose to ensure that she burned on the inside and the outside. There were rumors that have sadly been reported so many times that they've become canon for the case that the liquid was even poured down her throat, but that was denied by authorities and is categorically untrue. However, this was an incredibly brutal and thought-out attack and fire, and it was done to ensure that Jessica suffered greatly. Jessica was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance, and she sadly only lived for what must have been an excruciating 6 hours after the first responders found her at the scene. Jessica had second and third degree burns over 93 to 95% of her body. Jessica's mother, Lisa, was with her at her bedside in her final moments, and she said that she held her hand when Jessica took her last breath. Lisa told Jessica that it was okay to let go. As a part of the investigation, Jessica's car keys were found alongside a path that was near the crime scene, and her cell phone would be examined by investigators who were trying to determine what Jessica's movements had been earlier on that day. It was deemed that Jessica had spent the morning with 2 of her friends, and then she had gone to her mother Lisa's house to have a nap. Later, she then left after she had received a text message from someone, and she told her mom that she was going to get something to eat, and then she was going to clean out her car. At around 5:30 p.m., she went to a gas station that was located about 1.5 miles from where her body was ultimately found, and that would be the last time that Jessica was seen, this time on CCTV, before the fire took place. Location data that was used from Jessica's phone showed that she went to Batesville around 6 p.m., and she had then returned to Cortland around 6:30 p.m. It was never proven what she had done while she was in Batesville. About 15 minutes later, Jessica made a call to Lisa, and in hindsight, Lisa said that Jessica seemed unusually quiet. At 7:30 p.m., Jessica then was in the area where she would be found only 40 short minutes later. Like I said earlier, Jessica's story took off in the media locally and nationally, and her story quickly went viral on social media. This case, like I said, was of a beautiful white girl who had been brutally murdered in a town that was predominantly black, and it had all of the ingredients that were necessary to blow up for the right reasons and certainly for the wrong reasons. People were interested. People wanted to know what happened, and people wanted to know who was guilty. And of course, the internet sleuth community, who I've shared my disdain for many times over the years, took this case and absolutely ran with it. Alongside investigators who were in the area, you now had hundreds of armchair quarterbacks who had never been to or, frankly, even heard of Cortland, who were sharing their opinions and sharing their beliefs, and of course, sharing their racism and their hatred. In a small town like Cortland, whether it was investigators or it was people hundreds of miles away, everyone was a suspect. One of the pages that was started by Jessica's sister was on Facebook, and it still stands today. The page is called Justice for Jessica. Everybody was joining that page, and they were posting, and they were arguing about theories, about suspects, and about why the murder had taken place. People from Cortland were also responding on the page and defending themselves on social media. And of course, as you can guess, this helped the case go more viral. There was interaction. Not only did you have the sleuths all over the case, but you had the real people in that group explaining to perfect strangers why they were innocent and why their theories were crazy. It became a completely interactive investigation for anyone that wanted to try to help, or frankly, anyone that wanted to try to troll. Imagine living in Cortland and having to deal with people who you had never met from all over the world, who wanted to know where you were, what you were doing, and what your alibis were for the time that Jessica was murdered. It would be absolutely crazy. As I'm sure that any of you listening could imagine, race really took over the narrative of this case as well. People were digging up everything that everyone in Cortland had ever done. Every crime, every brush with the law, and everything that could be possibly found was found. The narrative from many people who were forcing themselves into the case seemed to be the desire to discover that Jessica had been murdered by a black man. It did come out that perhaps Jessica's family had an issue with race, even if they were not outwardly seen as racist. It was said that they had issues with the fact that Jessica had dated black men and that Jessica associated with black men regularly. People that knew Ben, Lisa, and the family said that it wasn't rooted in racism. They just didn't want their daughter dating the types of black men that she was dating. Ben has even said in interviews since the murder that it was not out of racism. He just desired for his daughter to date and marry a white man. This, of course, and these interviews, of course, only further stirred the pot of racism that was already boiling over in this case. Friends of Jessica were particularly upset by the racism that encircled the town because they said that Jessica herself had never seen color. Jessica didn't care what someone's race was, she only cared for the person themselves. There were even people posting on social media pages that Jessica deserved what happened to her. And they said that she deserved it because she dated black men. It's horrifying that people think this way. People, though, took that race narrative and they ran with it, inserting their own doctrines into the case, seemingly losing sight much of the time of what their real issue was. That, of course, being who had murdered Jessica. Social media's effect on the case was twofold. First of all, because many people believed that investigators were not doing the best job that they could be, it drew more and more people to the case because they wanted to outsmart the authorities. Jessica's sister said that she herself had to take breaks from social media because the hatred and the vitriol was too much. Jessica's mom, Lisa, though, seemingly developed a bit of a codependent relationship with the people on social media because she was being hurt very badly by one side, but she was also reliant on the support from the other side of people on social media, the people that were investigating. One of the things that I kept finding out about Cortland itself was at first, when Jessica was murdered, everyone in the small town was working together, and they were grieving together, until the racism came into the town from the outside and started to cause deep divides. It's been said that Cortland didn't see the kind of racism that came in after Jessica's murder prior to the murder. People had always, for the most part, coexisted in that small town. Regardless of what the reasoning was behind the murder, everyone that was close to it said that it was one of the most brutal and disturbing murders that they had ever heard about, let alone seen firsthand. It was also said that the attack would have almost certainly had to have been very personal, and that was because of the way that Jessica was murdered. The way she was murdered was designed to inflict the maximum amount of pain that was possible on her. Whoever had burned Jessica and the car was certainly a very sick individual. Whether it was the legit investigators or the internet sleuths, there were so many theories and so many quote-unquote suspects in the case. People online were pointing fingers at everyone, and everyone seemingly that had ever been around Jessica was being viewed as a suspect. Believe it or not, people had even said that it was Jessica's sister or Jessica's mother who had murdered her because she was insistent on dating black men. Jessica's father, Ben, was looked at as one of the prime suspects by the online community. He was working as a mechanic at the sheriff's office at the time, but he also had a criminal past, which I suppose was enough information to make him public enemy number one to people that didn't even know him. Ben's past included a drug conviction. Ben said that the fact that so many people believed that he had murdered his daughter was obviously hurtful, but he also knew that he knew the truth. District Attorney John Chambers said that nobody that mattered had ever believed that Ben had anything to do with the murder of Jessica, regardless of his history. Ali Alisani was another man who the sleuths took aim at. Ali worked at and ran the gas station that Jessica was last captured on CCTV before she was murdered. Ali's family owned the convenience store. People online started to say that it was the place where people would go for drug deals, insinuating that Ali was selling drugs. However, there didn't seem to be much evidence of that from anyone that was actually in Cortland. People said that because the video footage from the store was missing a chunk of time. They thought that Ali was responsible for that, and that he must also be trying to hide something. Ali, though, said that he was only trying to help by sending the tape to hopefully help police. Instead, what he received for his troubles were death threats, and people saying that he should go to prison. Ali said that he knew Jessica very well. He said that she was in the store nearly every day. The worst part was that based on everyone that knew him in Cortland, Ali was a nice young man. People said he was the kind of person that every community would want to have in their community. And yet, he was chased off because people who didn't even live there were telling him that they were going to burn him and burn the store down to the ground. A couple of Jessica's ex-boyfriends were also scrutinized by investigators and the online community as well, but the one that was believed to be most pertinent to the case was actually in jail at the time of the murder. This is where a lot of the gang talk started. People wondered if Jessica had snitched on her ex-boyfriend, who was named Travis Sanford, to get him into jail, or they wondered if people were worried she may snitch more now that he was in jail and he was her ex-boyfriend. There was reportedly a lot of gang activity in the small town of Cortland, especially with drug use and the sale of drugs. So that, combined with the fact that people seemed to believe that Jessica had snitched or may snitch, took over a lot of the narrative, and everyone from Travis to Ali to everyone in between was looked at as possibly having drug connections and possibly having gang connections. The real investigation, which was done by real investigators, was done in earnest. Based on the fact that it was believed that Jessica had said Eric or Derek, they looked into anyone that they could find from Cortland or the surrounding area who had that name of Eric or Derek. There was not any evidence to speak of in the vehicle because it had been started afire using an accelerant, and so because of that, not very much could have or did survive the fire. Everything around the fire, too, was essentially a mud pit because of the water that was necessary to extinguish the flames. There was nothing really in terms of physical evidence at or around the scene that could be used by investigators, which of course troubled the investigation from the very beginning. Investigators said that everyone that was interviewed for the case said that they would not have been able to kill someone in the manner that Jessica was killed. Many people said very plainly that if they wanted to kill somebody, they certainly could, but there was absolutely no way that they would be able to carry out a murder in the manner that the murder against Jessica was done. People were even coming to investigators in this case in an attempt to clear their names and also in an attempt to help the case in any way that they could. Jessica was beloved by many people. There were people who were even in gangs that were coming forward with anything that they thought might be pertinent for the case. Everyone, as I said earlier, was trying to help, at least in the beginning, in some form or fashion with the investigation and with finding the murderer. Ed Dixon, who was one of the detectives that was on the case, said that investigators were sleeping at the office and investigators were working countless hours in an attempt to solve this case. Everyone wanted to solve the case and nobody wanted to miss anything. Investigators, though, quickly realized that not only were they investigating a gruesome murder, they were also dealing with rising tensions from within Cortland and, of course, around the world through the online community and the viral case. Reward money was even offered up in this case. At first, there was an $11,000 reward, and then the reward money climbed all the way to $54,000. But investigators said that only 2 tips came in that seemed pertinent to the case, even with all of that money that was offered up for evidence that would lead to an arrest or a conviction in the case. Sadly, things seemed to go cold after a while there, and there was no more leads. There was not much evidence beyond what Jessica's cell phone had told them, and the police themselves were staying quiet, which, of course, always riles everyone up. However, 14 months after Jessica's murder, there was changes. There was an arrest that was made in the case, and it was someone that seemingly nobody had expected or suspected. The man that was arrested's name was Quentin Tellis. Quentin was indicted on a capital murder charge in February of 2016, and he also had prior convictions for burglary, drug possession, and fleeing from police. Quentin was also a member of a gang, but that fact would never be brought up in court or really in public. It was not believed by investigators to have been a part of any motive in the case. Investigators did not believe that Jessica's murder was gang-related whatsoever. Jessica and Quentin had met and exchanged phone numbers on November 29th of 2014, a week before Jessica was murdered, and it was reported that Tellis had started to try to sleep with Jessica in between those dates. On December 6th, the day of the murder, there were texts, there were phone calls, and there was video footage that proved that the two were in contact and the two were together, at least off and on, throughout the day. Tellis even confirmed to investigators that the two had been together. He was not hiding that fact whatsoever. Quentin first told investigators that he had only been with Jessica during the morning hours, and Tellis also claimed that he had been at a store in Batesville around the time of Jessica's murder. Tellis was found on video footage at that store in Batesville, but the time of that was 8:26 p.m., more than 15 minutes after the fire was discovered. Location data from his phone and Jessica's phone actually proved that it was likely that Tellis and Jessica had actually been together until roughly 7:30 p.m. And Tellis had previously been to Batesville with Jessica earlier in the evening, as Jessica's location services showed. When Tellis was told of the location data, he then switched his story, and he said instead that he was with Jessica until around 7 p.m., and then he said that another friend had picked him up from his house. His friend, though, didn't prove to be a good alibi. His friend told police that he was at a football game in Nashville on the night of the murder, and that friend's attendance at the game was proven, and thus Tellis' alibi was disproven. As I guess you can imagine, Tellis then changed his story again, and this time his story was that Jessica had picked him up that night and that they had gone to Taco Bell in Batesville, and he then claimed that the two had gone back to his house and sat in the car in his driveway listening to music. He said that Jessica had then left his home around 7 p.m. However, her location data still showed that she had been around the gas station around 7:30 p.m., which was very close to Tellis's house, and from there she had headed in the direction where the fire was later discovered. Between 6:49 p.m. and 7:26 p.m., Tellis received 5 different text messages from 5 different people, but he did not respond to any of those text messages. During that time, neither he nor Jessica had been on their phones. Tellis had then sent a text to Jessica's phone saying that he was going to spend time with a different woman that night, perhaps telling the truth or perhaps trying to establish an alibi for himself. Authorities believe that it was rather unlikely, though, that Jessica would have had time to encounter anyone else within the 30 minutes between when she reportedly left Tellis's house and then being discovered on fire. As such, investigators took a sample of Tellis's DNA, and they would find that it was a match to DNA that was found on Jessica's keys that had, as mentioned, been found along a path near the scene. Coincidentally, the pathway from the scene actually led from the scene of the fire towards the direction of where Tellis's sister lived. Investigators started to develop and work on a theory of what could have happened after Jessica and Tellis were known to have last been together. They, of course, focused on the keys that were dropped between the scene and Tellis's sister's home. So they believed that perhaps Tellis had choked Jessica unconscious, or he had otherwise detained her inside of the car and perhaps dropped her car keys as he was running towards his sister's home. It was then believed that Tellis had taken his sister's car and headed towards his own home. Around 7:50 p.m., a car was seen pulling into his driveway. The CCTV footage was grainy, but it was believed to have looked like his sister's car that was pulling into his driveway. Tellis did tell investigators that a storage shed on his property was used to store a 5-gallon gas container. It's believed that he may have retrieved that container and then returned to where Jessica and her car were located. Investigators believed that that was when Tellis would have set the fire to Jessica and to Jessica's car, and then there was a car seen speeding from the scene of the fire towards Batesville, which Tellis was then seen on CCTV at 8:36 p.m. Investigators also noticed when looking over the various CCTV footage in the case that Tellis had changed his clothing 3 times during the day. It would later come to light also when questioned that Tellis had deleted all of his communications with Jessica within only 1 hour of her being announced as deceased, even though he had been in constant contact with Jessica for days before her murder. Those deleted messages showed that Jessica had in fact denied him sex on at least 4 occasions just on the day of her murder. Tellis stated that he and Jessica had in fact had sex once in the week leading up to her murder. Ultimately, Tellis would go to trial in October of 2017, and the trial came down to the DA, led by John Champion, leaning heavily into location data, text messages, and what appeared to be circumstantial evidence based on grainy video footage and poor connective tissue for the story, with a lack of hard evidence. The defense for Tellis, which was led by Darla Palmer, of course hinged a lot of their defense on the fact that Jessica had said the name Eric or Derek to first responders at the scene. Cole Haley, who was the first responder at the scene, said that Jessica was in such bad shape when he arrived that when she emerged from the bushes, he did not even recognize who she was. He said that she came towards him with her arms outstretched and she was saying, "Help me, help me." When he was asked to describe what Jessica looked like, he started to cry on the stand, and he said that her hair was frizzed out like she had stuck a fork into an electrical outlet, and he could tell that she was badly burned over her entire body. He went on to say that the inside of her mouth was charred black, and when he asked her what her name was, he was able to decipher that she said Jessica Chambers. Cole said that the scene was unlike anything that he had ever seen before, and he hoped that he, nor anyone else, would ever have to see such a scene again. Cole had left the fire department after this incident, giving up his lifelong dream of being a firefighter. Many of the first responders corroborated everything that Cole said. Especially the parts when asked who had done this to Jessica. Many different responders said that she had responded by saying either Derek or Eric. At least 2 first responders also mentioned that they had seen a suspicious man who was hanging around the scene of the crime that night as well. That man was described as a middle-aged black man who walked up and was told that it was an active crime scene and that he needed to leave. The man was said to have stared blankly at the scene, and then, without a word, the man turned and walked away. The defense team, as you can imagine, jumped on this because the man that was being described did not sound like Tellis, and the man, even though he was referred to as suspicious, had not been stopped or questioned or even identified by anyone at the scene. I have to admit that that's weird to me. It's hard to believe that someone could look at a scene like the one that took Jessica's life and then just allow a passerby to pass by without some line of questioning. This was not the only strange part of the investigation, though. As mentioned, Jessica had emerged from a nearby forest, and evidently that forested area had never been searched for evidence or anything. Only the scene of the fire was looked at by investigators. To me, researching this case, this seemed like really sloppy police work, but I am also now being a sleuth who's not on that investigative team, so that strictly is an opinion. Another miss by investigators happened when Tellis was initially spoken to. When Tellis admitted that he had deleted his conversations with Jessica, the FBI agent who was questioning him never asked Tellis why he had deleted the messages. When asked at trial by the defense team why he had not asked that crucial question, the agent said that it was simply an error in his questioning. That's a pretty significant error, if you ask me. Tellis would later say that he had deleted the correspondence with Jessica because he did not want to have conversations with a dead person on his phone. Tellis's family seemed to understand that as a motive for deleting the messages, but for me, I certainly assume that if I had spent the last day of someone's life with them, I would keep that information on my phone so that the evidence was readily available and clear. When the jury returned to the courtroom after the trial, the initial verdict that was read was not guilty, but it was discovered that the jury had actually, in fact, misunderstood the instructions of the trial judge. They had believed that for a verdict of guilty, they had to be unanimous, but for a verdict of not guilty, they did not believe that they had to be unanimous. It was determined that the jury was not unanimous, and they were dispatched again, but the jury ultimately would return and say that they could not reach a verdict, and so a mistrial was declared. One thing that was not mentioned as a part of the trial was the fact that Tellis had also been previously arrested in 2015 for the murder of another woman. This woman's name was Ming Chen Sao, and her credit cards he had been caught with, and he was using after her death. Tellis had been connected to that case through cell phone and text records as well. Tellis had known Ming Chen for a few weeks, and they had allegedly been involved in some semblance of a relationship. In that case, Tellis was the last person to have texted her before she was murdered. If that story sounds familiar to you, it certainly does to me as well. This almost looks like an MO, which I'm sure is a large part of why investigators leaned so heavily into Tellis. However, if I'm playing devil's advocate, that could also be the explanation for why police focused so hard on Tellis, because they certainly needed to quiet the masses with some sort of arrest in that case. So, sadly, there's not been any justice or closure for anyone that knew Jessica, and this case is still open, and it is still active. In the time since that second trial, Travis Sanford, Jessica's ex-boyfriend, who was, as mentioned, in jail at the time of the murder, was also shot and killed at his home that he shared with his girlfriend and her 2 children in Cortland. Jessica's mother, Lisa, also passed away on October 29th of 2021, sadly without seeing any justice for the murder of her daughter. This one is an ugly story. A family and an entire town was torn apart. A beautiful young girl who was trying to get her life together was taken far too soon, and so many other lives have also been ruined or forever changed. Cases like this one, where you see a small town torn apart, get to me, and yet again show that people can change lives of others who they have never even met. Internet sleuths think that they're doing so much good, and yet, quite often, the majority of them are simply stirring up trouble. Cases are often rushed to shut down the masses, and this one, frankly, looks like one of those to me. There's certainly a lot of evidence that shows that Tellis could have been the guilty party in this case, but in terms of hard evidence, there doesn't seem to be very much. I don't know if we will ever see closure in this one. I can only hope and wish and pray that we do. I couldn't help but to do what I'm sure many people have done. I manipulate my mouth a little, like someone who doesn't have much mobility, and I can certainly see how Tellis could come out sounding like Eric or Derek under the circumstances that this poor girl was in. But that's certainly not something that can ever be proven. So I ask you, what do you think of this case? Do you believe that Quentin Tellis is the guilty party? Do you believe that there is enough hard evidence to prove that? Hop on over to social media, or come on over to patreon.com/GBNF podcast to let me know what you think. While you're at it, please take the time to give the podcast a rating, a follow, and a review wherever you listen, if you do indeed like the show and like what I'm doing here. Aside from that, of course, I hope that you and yours are well. I hope that you and yours are trying to be a part of the solution. And of course, I hope that you are always trying to be better. Thank you one more time for listening, and I will see you next week on Gone But Never Forgotten.